Hello students, this is the second lecture that is designed to prepare you to take your examination on Thursday. Now the first lecture we looked at the terrorist mindset and the emphasis was on that particular requirement for a terrorist group to exist. They need individuals who have that particular mindset, and we looked at the individual and some of the group factors that in combination prepare people to actually have the capability and the intent to commit violent acts. Now for this tape, I want to look at chapters 1 through 4, which are the chapters you are responsible for the exam, and just kind of highlight some what I think might be potential problem areas and maybe clarify a few things and possibly expound on a few things. Now if you remember in chapter 1, we're looking at definitions. And you realize, of course, that your chapter has a variety of elements that go into a definition. The one thing that you should be clear on is that apart from the academic definitions, we do have actual operational definitions that are used by law enforcement bodies within the United States and in other countries. And those definitions are actually the ones that matter. They're the ones that we'll be referring to in actual operations against terrorism and the eventual prosecutions. I mentioned in lecture in class that there was a very important decision, United States versus Keith, and that involved the FBI and the FBI's use of various techniques in combating terrorism. And in the Keith decision, the Supreme Court clearly set down that clearly decided that the FBI had to ensure that they protected civil liberties when they were involved in an investigation, including into espionage or terrorism within the United States, that was the predominant concern they had to have. Well, that caused the FBI to basically split their investigative focuses between domestic terrorism cases in the United States, international terrorism, and purely criminal investigations. When they did that, they also had to start looking at the definitional problem came into play. And I mentioned that the FISA Act, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that's the longest standing definition that actually exists in the federal government as far as it involves, and it is in connection with an actual technique to investigate espionage cases and terrorism cases. Now, the FISA Act, the definition is, again, it's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And when by surveillance, we're talking about not only physical but electronic surveillance. And in that definition, first set out in 1978, I mentioned, 1978, Congress said that international terrorism means activities that involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws, and that's important. There's basically not adding anything. They're referring to existing criminal laws of the U.S. or any state, and that would be a criminal violation if committed within the jurisdiction of the United States, federal, or any state. So we have to have a specific law violation. And part 2, so these activities appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. So the FISA Act is identifying the target group for terrorist actions, even though the immediate target might not be the actual, that might not be the real intended target of the act. Blowing up a statute, that's the physical target, but the primary target of that particular explosion, that technique, was the civilian group that the terrorist group would feel that action against property could cause fear in their civilian target organization. So it's to intimidate, of course, the civilian population, to influence and that's or, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. So now we have another alternative where, even though it's not civilians, if they're trying to directly influence government actions, it's basically the government becomes the actual real target of the act of violence, which has to be a violation of a criminal law. Or, and this is the third one, to affect the conduct of the government by assassination or kidnapping. Now we're looking at two specific crimes which are mentioned, which are not always connected to a more organized group. In fact, these could be done by one or two individuals. And lastly, occur totally outside the United States or transcend national boundaries in the way they are, the means by which they are accomplished. Or the persons themselves who are intended to be coerced or to intimidate, or the locale in which their perpetrators operate and seek asylum. So that you have a linkage here that the act can occur totally outside of the U.S. or transcend boundaries in the way they accomplish it, or the persons they intend to coerce, or the locale in which they seek asylum or they operate. So they could be an international act, even though the target is in the U.S., if the terrorists are operating on a worldwide basis. So it's a fairly inclusive definition. Now, the Patriot Act, which was passed in 2001, after the events on 9/11, the Patriot Act looked at the FBI's definition of domestic terrorism and basically, again, used the same standard language as far as violent acts that are a violation of the criminal laws of the U.S. or any state that appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population, to influence the policy of the government, or to affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, the addition of mass destruction, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So it doesn't mean domestic terrorism can have ancillary activity going on in a foreign venue. But if the act of terrorism, the acts occur primarily within the U.S., then it falls under domestic terrorism. Now that actually becomes a little bit restrictive, because under the Keith decision, if it's an act of domestic terrorism, the FBI and other investigative agencies operating under the FBI's purview they have to adhere to our civil liberties under the U.S. Constitution. Okay, going on in Chapter 1, there's basically the general idea that terrorism is a pejorative term, that it often has involved the issue of whether or not people who commit acts of violence against civilians can in some cases be called freedom fighters. And that basic battle between, are you a terrorist or freedom fighter, is explained, and we looked at Professor Crenshaw's model as to how you determine whether or not someone is a terrorist or a freedom fighter. And if you remember that, we went over that in class, looking at the target, the actual objective, the tactics involved, and whether or not that act had a possibility of success. And oftentimes with many terrorist groups, many of which are too small to be effective and don't last probably more than 18 months, which is the normal time span of most terrorist groups, and they are small. Usually their actions will not meet the third criteria of possibility of success. They're valueless acts in that they will not achieve a goal, and it's mainly just for expressive needs of the members of the group. They don't really have a real instrumental focus because they don't have a chance of success. Okay, moving to chapter 2, we're looking at a brief history of terrorism. Now it starts out with a paragraph on the Thuggees. The Thuggees were, I differ with Professor Younger here in one regard. I think he's using the Thuggees as a point. I would say the Thuggees are a better example of a group that's essentially criminal, that you would refer to that it did actually terrorize people, but I would not call it a terrorist group or organization. The Thuggees were thieves, and they used assassination, predominantly strangling, stabbings, as a method in India. It went on for basically not as long. I noticed that he basically took a time span on here that was more, doubtful it was 1,200 years. But in any event, they were Hindus. They did worship the goddess Kali, but they were not really religiously motivated on a general basis. There were probably certain members of the Thuggees that were, but most of the Thuggees, the memberships of the thugs, these are individuals who came into it because it was a way to make money. There was a lot of travelers on the road. They often traveled with wealth. They systemized their attacks. Many of the Thuggees were actually family members of people who had been involved as thugs. There was traditional aspects to it, but generally this was a criminal operation in which the religion that they practiced was also practiced by non-Thuggees. And although some of the older Thuggees may have had they may have had an adherence to the religious traditions more for the reason of not falling out of favor with the gods. Paying attention to, paying observance to the goddess Kali in order that she would favor them. But as far as being driven to commit their acts by her commands, I don't think the evidence in that really bears this out, except in a few circumstances. But it is an example of how a group can develop a very violent mindset, take individuals and mold them through traditions and pressure, and the fact that they operated underground in the secret. All the things that go into developing a group mind, which is important to understand. Group minds are formed with pressure. When you're afraid of being discovered, the group kind of takes over. All thought processes eventually become a group consensus, and that is the way the Thuggees operated. So that they are relevant in that way. And again, there were thousands of them. Okay, then there's a general history, the French Revolution, which, remember, the French Revolution was actually an example of the terrorism that was practiced. There was an example of state terrorism, or terrorism from the top down. They wanted to terrorize the populace because they did not want to lose the power that they had gained from a social revolution in which many of the lower and the middle classes had assumed power from the aristocracy. We look at the growth of terrorism, and we'll notice that the 1848 revolution in France, which spread throughout Europe, Spring of the Peoples, there we had a bottom-up series of revolutions. This really, now we're looking at kind of the start of what we regard as modern terrorism, with the initial impetus of the terrorist movement from the French government. And then later in the next century, we see the 1848 revolution. Now we see the populace, the underclass, revolting against the aristocracy, and in this case, basically, and there was a spread. There was a spread, and we're looking at these actions essentially resulting in the development of a terrorist group that still exists today, the anarchists, and called anarchist terror, because you can be an anarchist without being a terrorist. So an anarchist terrorist, which spread in Europe, predominantly more active in Germany, Russia, France, somewhat in Italy, spread to the United States. The anarchists were involved in a variety of different social movements, but their general philosophy was that government was bad, government was corrupt. That basically it was better to eliminate government, and if necessary, violent means could be used to do that. So that was one of our basically pivotal groups, which still exists today. The anarchist photograph of U.S. President McKinley. An anarchist attacked him. A little bit on then the movement towards nationalism, and we're looking at the typologies. Make sure you know the typologies. So we really have the anarchist movement, moving into the nationalist and ethnic separatism movements that really, and we also had the IRA activities in Ireland, the battle over Northern Ireland, the setting up of the Free Irish Republic. That was going on, and there was this. You had both of these currents operating at the same time, the anarchist current and the nationalistic current, but it became much more widely spread in the beginning really in the 20th century. So, and we did have state terrorism again, remember Germany, China, and the USSR, anti-colonialism. The anti-colonialism merged with the anti-colonialism is a synonym for nationalistic terrorism. Our video on the Battle of Algiers was a really good example of anti-colonialism and nationalistic terrorism. The Algerians wanted their own country. They fought the French, went on for several years. Violent conflict. They used guerrilla warfare as their major tool throughout the countryside. But within the major cities, they used terrorism. They were unsuccessful at the end. The French used a great deal of force on them, torture, military involvement. But Algeria did end up getting their freedom from France. They lost over 200,000 people in that war with France. But it was the harbinger of, of more pressure for freedom for the remaining colonial governments in the world. And we know we have ideological terrorism, the left and the right wing. We've got religious terrorism in this century, even though we know we had the beginning of it in the first century, the Common Era, when we have, where we have the Sicarii, the Sicarii sect of the Zealots in Judea, fighting the Roman occupation, and then in the 12th and 13th century we have the Shiite Ismaili sect today, called the Assassins because of the hashish that people believe they smoked. That group fighting against the Seljuk Turks, a little bit against the Crusaders, but basically they were Shiites fighting against the Sunnis in what is today would be called Syria and Iran. They were eliminated by the Mongols in the 13th century. So we had early religious terrorism, then we had religious terrorism in Europe, although it didn't fall under that name because it was really, there were a series of civil wars. Moving into today's religious terrorism, really we're looking at the 80s and the 90s and currently, and we see both some domestic religious-based terrorism, but the most prominent form of religious-based terrorism, although it exists in many countries in many different forms, what we've seen today are the jihadi or takfiri Muslim terrorist groups, where they They basically take a corrupted form of a very fundamentalist form of Islam, demonize their enemies, including other Muslims, that if you don't adhere to their basic doctrines that they believe in, then you can be murdered, you can be killed. That form of religious terrorism, characterized obviously by Al-Qaeda as the prototypical example of a group that had existential beliefs, and we kind of gave them as an existential threat to the Western world, although they probably really were not, but we certainly regarded them as such. They are the best example of what can happen when these types of religious beliefs have enough support from money donors, which they did have in many other countries that actually supported them, and also that they have a relatively secure base. So there are some things that they need, although they're also unique in that they operated without really having any really home country. They shifted around, and some of the memberships were basically almost itinerant terrorists drifting around in terrorist conflicts, and still do throughout the world. We'll look a lot more at those groups later in the course. We also seen really the growth of criminal terrorism, although again that has really existed historically also. But today we see it probably more in some of the older groups of terrorists who, to gain funding for their activities, often became involved in criminal activities, which is the way you fund, one of the ways you fund terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda utilized that, but not as much, because they were able to tap some deep pockets. But they did use different forms of criminal activity. But a key group of this would be the IRA, which became today, at least for a lot of the later 21st century and into the late 20th century, the IRA was probably more involved in criminal acts than they were any other type of actually truly revolutionary terrorist activities. So we do know criminal terrorist groups are there. It's basically because of this funding process, and in some cases it's hard to distinguish whether they are really terrorists or they're criminals. And again, that's something we'll talk about more later in the course. So on page 24 gives you a pretty good overview, and you should know that. And we move down to Terrorism 3, and this again we went over in a fair amount of detail, and I mean, as far as when I talked about the terrorist mindset. And on these chapters, I will say, to start out with, in chapter 3, they talk about the Stockholm syndrome. Again, the author of the book, I think, is looking at this differently than I do. The Stockholm syndrome, as he's correctly pointed out, involved a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. Where I think this is important is to realize that the radicalization process, the idea that people can be swayed surprisingly easily to favor individuals who actually, in this case, are criminals but could have been terrorists relatively quickly. And the real goal of the Stockholm syndrome is not the fact that the hostages start to like the terrorists. What the whole process involves the terrorists. In fact, the criminals generally, you want the criminals to eventually like the hostages, because from a negotiation standpoint, this is what you want to see develop. Because when that happens, when they identify the hostages as human beings and develop a feeling of somewhat at least affection for them, because in the meantime they've seen the hostages show that they like them. They kind of are starting to identify with them. In both groups, the hostages and the hostage takers are angry at the government, then you have a situation that can be resolved. However, psychopathic individuals, you're not going to develop the end result of the Stockholm Syndrome. The hostages may think it developed because psychopathic individuals are able to assume this mask that they like them, but they don't. That's not going to help the situation resolve. Terrorists are often, because of their overriding perception as to accomplishing their goal, in which they've already filtered out any types of sentiment towards the people that they've taken hostage. It won't work for them. So terrorists can be very dangerous in a hostage situation, which has been one of their tactics, and to publicize their cause. So the idea that you're going to resolve this because they don't want the hostages to be hurt, that's highly unlikely. But anyway, the Stockholm Syndrome, I think it's more important about Patty Hearst, when she was kidnapped by a terrorist group in this country called the Symbionese Liberation Army. One thing we saw there was her radicalization, how quickly she turned from a pampered child of a very wealthy family to a fairly hardcore revolutionary of a group that was nihilistic at best. And that was done pretty quickly to her, using isolation and then basically tapping into her relatively emotional immaturity and being able to make her see the world in a different sense while she was in this group under pressure, and she became a victim of groupthink. And so what we had, it's very interesting how that happened to her, and how when she was eventually released, not released, but when she was eventually arrested, and today, of course, she's out of prison, she's been totally pardoned, and then went back to her own life, married a former Secret Service agent. So that's the Patty Hearst deal. But basically, the main thing about Chapter 3 and 4 is you're looking at two basic schools of thought. And remember this, when you look at how terrorists, what makes a terrorist, then you've got two basic general perceptions: the psychological perception, where you look at the individual, and then you have the sociological perspective, where you look at the situational, the environmental aspects of the terrorist's life and how that influences the terrorist. The psychological aspect is broken down into two basic theories. One is that terrorists are rational thinkers, and the second one is that truly terrorists are emotionally driven and by subconscious drives, and by, in some cases, some individual pathologies or certain distinct traits, and that are some of the reasons why they move into committing acts, into joining the groups and committing terrorist acts. The sociological perspective talks a lot, and that's Chapter 4 in your text, talks a lot about the social processes, and that's about the group think process, the development, the pressures of a group. And it's important to understand that. You're looking at those two chapters, 3 and 4, as one, an individually based, and two, the sociological based, which looks at the environment and the situational pressures, both the underlying situation of the society that the individuals are part of, and then the immediate precipitants. And these are theories. This has been developed by, again, Professor Martha Crenshaw, very influential scholar. And overriding Crenshaw's description of these situational aspects is also her belief that the terrorists are essentially rational, that they may have some characteristics that are necessary to be successful, but these characteristics can sometimes be developed through the group processes, the pressures of the society that are so important to terrorism. Of course, we know today, and we're seeing more of an emphasis today, that really individuals can commit terrorist acts, become radicalized on the basis of their own self-desires, their own program. That is possible to do. It's pretty difficult, and there are the people who fall into that basic mode of action, the lone wolf type action, often have some serious personality problems. In some cases, truly actually could be somewhere on the psychotic scale of behavior, but functional, able to plan, but their basic underlying reasons would not make sense to any average rational person. So I think that should do it. I think if you hit these 4 chapters, pay attention to my lectures, the two lectures, the notes from my class lecture, and the PowerPoint. I think you should be fine on the exam. 4 chapters, all lecture notes, PowerPoint, the 2 video lectures, and make sure you understand these big overall concepts so that you can, so it doesn't confuse you, that there's some just basic large themes which I've went over. So pay attention to what I went over these 2 lectures because they do set the overall parameters of these 4 chapters. So thank you, and good luck on your examination on Thursday.